Let me start with something cheerful I heard yesterday. The only thing I don't like about my Tesla is the radio. The radio doesn't pull in a lot of stations that I want, or where I live doesn't give good coverage. So I listen to a lot of podcasts when I'm driving. And one of the ones that I listen to is the New York Times Daily. They have a daily column or a daily interview about some subject of import. And yesterday they had a woman on who used to be a Washington operative. And she married a guy from Ohio. She went to live in Ohio and she was commuting to Washington doing some kind of political work. I don't even remember her name. I'm embarrassed to say. But she decided that she wanted to stay home and get to know the women and organize the women in Ohio, a state that had gone for President Trump. And so she started meeting women, and she started expanding her little meetings and going to similar groups of women who were interested in politics and talking. And she put together a group called Red Wine and Blue. And the wine was not WHINE, it was red wine. And so she would get these groups of women together, and they were not exactly political groups because she had people who had voted for Trump, she had people who'd voted for third party candidates, but they got together as women and they hashed things over as women in non-ideological, really straightforward, clear-minded ways. And what I heard that made me laugh was that they had expanded their circles quite extraordinarily. And there were women who had voted for Trump for their own reasons, and they felt bad about it, and they were trying to make amends. And there were people that voted for third-party candidates out of making statements with their vote, and they regretted that. But they were talking about Trump's latest talking point, where he's talking about suburban housewives and how much he loves them. And these women were laughing and saying, he has no idea who we are. And as an example, they pointed out that he's threatening them, or he's trying to frighten them by saying, if Biden wins, they're going to build projects in your neighborhood, and he's going to put Cory Booker in charge of it all. And he raised the specter of this big, strong black man to frighten them. And what these women said was, oh my God, Cory Booker's coming? Where's my lipstick? Get my high heels out. And it was such a surprising turnaround. And it gave me such confidence in kind of the good nature and good sense of most people. And many of these women were turned from being Trump voters by listening to their children. That was another interesting thing about this podcast. Their kids were coming to them and saying, why does President Trump make fun of people wearing masks? Why doesn't the president wear a mask? These are 9 and 10-year-old children. Saying, we spent every day teaching our kids to share, to be polite, to be kind, not to be mean. And now you have the most powerful person in the country setting the most odious examples. And a couple of the women laughed and said, yeah, we'd like to get this guy in our house for a few days. We would straighten this out. So in the midst of all this anxiety about who's going to win the election and what's going to happen, these women were such a ray of hopefulness and light, and proceeding in a non-doctrinaire, non-ideological way, woman to woman, mother to mother, wife to wife, drinking red wine and talking convivially as people do. And what was interesting about it was the marked absence of politics, the lightness of it, the absence of heaviness. So at the risk of reintroducing heaviness, I did want to talk today about suppose the election goes to Donald Trump again. What would it mean? What could we infer from it? And what can our spiritual practice do to help us? So I want to just dive into it a little bit. So you would think that after the 2000 election of Bush versus Gore, which was basically decided by the Supreme Court in a vote that 5-4 vote, which they announced would not be a precedent. It was a one-off vote, highly unusual, where they stopped the counting of votes in Florida. And the counting of votes in Florida was a little complicated because Al Gore picked 4 counties that would have been really good for him to recount. And the Republicans saw right away that he was not recounting the whole state. He was trying to skew the game his way. And Roger Stone, whose name you may have mentioned, led what's called the Brooks Brothers Rebellion. He led a whole bunch of Republican operatives and office staff into the Miami-Dade vote counting rooms outside. And they made such a ruckus that the people stopped the vote count. So they were actually bullied into stopping the vote count. And what they were crying on the outside was voter fraud. And this was the first introduction of this topic by Republicans. You see that they've been using it ever since. So the case went to the Supreme Court, and the presidency was given to George Bush by the court. Well, you would think that from that moment on, the primary preoccupation of Democrats would be getting judges into various levels of the court, making sure that voter suppression did not exist, fighting to get the Voting Rights Act protected, which ended in 2013, at least the aspect of it that forced southern states to get permission from the federal government before they made any changes to voting procedures. And as soon as that was over, they began systematic voting suppression. Who were they suppressing? They're suppressing Democratic voters, basically black people, people of color, people they think will be Democratic voters. So I would have thought that that would have been a priority. And I thought it would have been a priority to have some kind of movement toward federal standards for federal elections. Things stand now, the elections are handled by the states, which really means they're handled by the counties. So let's say there are 10,000 counties in the United States. When the Russians are trying to attack our elections, and they have, that's a pretty foregone conclusion. It's not like Russia versus the United States. It's like Russia versus the county clerk in Chillicothe, Ohio. It's a very uneven match. And yet since 2000, basically no serious protections have gone into protecting our vote. Mitch McConnell has a number of bills on his desk, which he's just stopped, which would have ensured protecting the vote and opening the vote up to others. So the Republicans know that they are a minority party, and they've been extremely intelligent about learning how to rule from a minority position. They've gerrymandered, so even though they have less votes, they have more seats in many state houses. They may be 35-40% of the vote, but they are winning 54% of the House seats. And that's a tremendous advantage because then they get to write the voting rules and they get to write the laws. So they've been doing this for a long time, certainly since 2000, and they've developed their operations. Voter fraud is a very successful, although fraudulent, concern. There's virtually no evidence of voter fraud. But so let's say they're successful. And let's say Trump squeaks through and wins the Electoral College, as he did last time. He was 3 million votes below Hillary, but he won the Electoral College. And one of the other problems that was never squared away in the Electoral College is the Electoral College is a winner-take-all system. And if you think about it, it's inequitable on the face of it. Each state gets the same number of electoral votes as they have senators. So it gives a much greater emphasis to small states, because if California has 2 senators and Rhode Island has 2 senators, you can see those are very differing representations of the population. So in a winner-take-all situation, if a candidate wins the vote by 1 vote, he gets all the electoral votes of that state. So the state may have been split, 43 to 47. And all those people that voted on the other side of the winner are disenfranchised. Their votes absolutely don't count. So in states where they do their electoral votes by the county, you'll see at the convention, they'll say, Alaska gives so many votes to so-and-so and so many votes to so-and-so. And in that way, all the voters are represented. So we have all these basic inequities that are built into the system that are not democratic, and they're anti-democratic. The Electoral College itself is anti-democratic. The Electoral College was put in place and basically supported slavery by allowing slave owners to count slaves as 2/3 of a white man, which increased the population of those areas and gave them more representation in Congress. And none of these things have really been reviewed. So sometimes they break in the Democrats' favor, sometimes they break in the Republicans' favor, but they don't necessarily break in the favor of the people, because in a winner-take-all system, the losers, the 49% to the 51%, have no voice, have no speech. And there are many, many other voting systems that are in use all over the United States. Tiered votings, or where you get multiple choices, or where you put down your first, second, and third choice, so that if your first choice doesn't win, your second choice immediately goes up. There's a woman named Lani Guinier who wrote a very good book about this during the Clinton administration. And she caused such a ruckus that Clinton fired her. But it was basically a very scholarly book on how you protect minorities from winner-take-all situations where they will never get representation if they're minorities. So this is the system we have, and we need to be clear-eyed about it, and we need to know about it. And we need to know about it so that we can make demands on our legislators if things break our way. But suppose they don't break our way. Suppose Trump wins the election. Well, in the first place, it's going to be very contentious because we're not going to be sure. We're not going to be sure that the Russians did not affect our voting booths, our voting machinery. Our intelligence agencies tell us they had things they knew about that the Russians held in abeyance, but they didn't know what they were. So the vote itself will be in question. And even if it looks like Biden has won the vote itself will be in question, because Republicans will cry voter fraud, and they'll make such a stink that they will put pressure on legislators to actually overcome the Electoral College and appoint their own electors. So in any case, there's going to be a long period of uncertainty and tension and anger and feeling of being abused and cheated. But let's suppose for a second that he actually wins, that he actually squeaks through the Electoral College. So I think the first thing we have to do is ask ourselves, well, what does this mean? And I think what it means is pretty clear. Because Trump is he's a little bit like Edgar Bergen's famous dummy, Charlie McCarthy. He's the ventriloquist for vast fortunes and piles of private capital, hedge funds, derivatives, real estate, insurance, major fortunes and trust funds are quite civilized, decorous people who don't approve of Trump at all. But they approve of the fact that he's delivered them the courts, that he's been very aggressive about filling the courts with conservative judges, so that even as a minority, they can win policy arguments through the courts, not by the vote. And I'm not sure that the implications of that are really clear to everyone, that with the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett to the court, we have 9 unelected people who can accomplish by legislation what their proponents could not accomplish by the vote. And that we're all under that umbrella of belief that the Supreme Court should be the last voice on the law of the land. So if Trump wins, it's going to mean that these forces of capital, these owners of capital and wealth and power, have decided that they want to die with their own toys and their own power. That they are not going to give it up. That they're not going to accede to any of the objective demands of climate, inequity, social turbulence, whatever. Many of these people are my age. I'm 79. Many of them are in their 60s and 70s. And I think you can see that they're taking a gamble that the worst consequences of global warming and the political situation will occur after they're gone. We can make judgments about what it means to leave such a situation for their children and grandchildren, but we shouldn't fool ourselves that that's what it is. That's what's going on. So we may very well, as citizens, be facing a situation where we are suddenly in the same boat as the rest of the third world, that the United States has colonized and plundered, there's no other word for it really, for centuries, and now is doing to its own citizens what we've been doing abroad. In some cases, fracking and oil development goes on despite the risks to the environment, despite the objections of the people. They're no longer free to say. When they can light their faucet water on fire, they can't drink the water. Or when the people in Flint, Michigan are still being poisoned by lead and the government is not spending the money to build their infrastructure again, you can begin to see that there's a judgment base, that certain citizens have less of a footing than the corporate sector. And I think one of the reasons for this that is almost never talked about, I mean, it's a taboo to talk about it, is that the Gordian knot that keeps our system together is the fact that it's organized around money, around the acquisition of money. You only have to look at your emails these days. If you're like me, you're getting 20 to 30 to 40 emails a day begging for money. And the idea that your $5 or your $10 is going to compete with the hedge funds and the derivatives in putting candidates in office is a joke. And until we do something about that, we've been disenfranchised as citizens. So the Supreme Court ruling, Citizens United, which allowed for unlimited flows of unidentified money into the voting system, basically changed our country from a democracy into a corporatocracy. I don't know another way to look at it. I'm a huge fan of President Obama. Disagreed with a lot of stuff while he was in office, but he's been the greatest president of my lifetime. And yet, only 40% of his campaign was paid for by small donations. And the other 60% was paid for by the people who should have gone to jail in 2008 for wrecking the economy, for selling fraudulent mortgages, for evaluating the mortgages fraudulently, for participating in gambling with people's bank accounts and money. And there was not a penny of fines paid. No one went to jail. No chief executive lost their job. There's a fellow named Black who was the federal investigator of the savings and loan scandal, which happened 20 years earlier, who said that these things could not have happened without the corporate sector being involved. The C chamber, the CEOs, the COOs, the CFOs. So we're seeing more and more that great wealth buys great political power, and this political power continues to skew the system toward its own advantage, so that these people pay less taxes. Nobody's cutting the military budget, even though no battleship, no jet, no rocket, no super weapon has saved a single life from COVID. The people who invest in military technology and weapons, their bank accounts are doing fine. And yet our political system can't get together to vote relief to the hundreds of millions of people who are out of work, losing their jobs, in danger of being foreclosed or evicted. It seems quite clear. And it seems that in order to be able to do anything, we have to be able to see this clearly, and we have to be able to see it without being derailed, without being thrown off our balance. On one level, you could say this is karma. This is the chickens coming home to roost. This is the way wealth and power, American wealth and power, has been dealing with the world. It's also the way every nation of wealth and power deals with the world. They do what they can. And for those people, democracy is a last thought. They don't really care about it. You can actually see that the current Republican Senate is not at all concerned about democracy. They want to rule. And they're not embarrassed about having power. They're not embarrassed about exercising it. They do it ruthlessly. They denied President Obama a Supreme Court pick in the last year of his term. And they gave Trump a Supreme Court justice in the last weeks of his term. So that's what we have to see. So the question is, what do we do in such a case? Well, the first thing we have to do is take care of ourselves. And if we surrender to panic, to anxiety, to fear, we're not going to be any good to ourselves or our neighbors or our children. So it's always a great thing to go out every morning and watch the sun come up. It's just fantastic. I bow to the sun every morning in gratitude. It's cold and this sun comes up and it lights everything. And every plant, every tree, every flower, every animal wakes up in gratitude. And we should too. Because no matter what the political system is, there is the sun coming up every morning. There are the trees producing oxygen. There are the clouds. There will hopefully be rain. This is not to be Pollyanna-ish, but to put things in perspective. Just imagine that we were living in the Middle Ages and we had no television, radio, or media or anything. We wouldn't even know about an invasion of our country until we saw the people coming in over the hill. So until that point, life would be life. We'd be getting the kids up, we'd be out in the fields, we'd be doing this, we'd be doing that, in the same kind of calm and quiet that we find when we meditate. So one of the reasons I urge people to meditate is to learn how to extend that calmness into your everyday life. Because we're going to need it. Because it's very possible that we're entering a period of great inequity, great unfairness, and there'll be expressions of rage and anger and rebellion. And they rarely turn out well. You can overthrow a government, and then you have a new government that's in power and has all the wealth, and at a certain time, it becomes like the old government in many regards. I'm not saying that effort is futile, because the great model that I keep in mind is the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, where everybody came out in the streets and they just stopped participating. And they had a bloodless revolution that appointed a wonderful playwright, Václav Havel, as the president. So I wanted to suggest that that's something that we begin to think about and begin to hold in our minds. You and I know that money is the organizing principle of our election. And people can say, let's get the money out of politics, but that's like a New Year's resolution. No one really knows what to do or what it means. No one puts out a plan. But there are things that could happen. We, the people, could insist on paying for all the candidates' campaigns. Everybody gets the same amount of money, and we watch what they do with it and how they behave. We, the people, could say, once we put our people in office, it's illegal to give them any money, gifts, junkets, tickets, emoluments. We want them to work for us. But until we do that, until we pay their salaries, until we put them in office, they don't work for us, and they know it. Their main job is paying back the donors that they need to get in office. And they do it invisibly to us. They do it through tax legislation, which we can't see. They do it through writing little loopholes in the legislation, which we can't see. And doing this for 40, 50 years has created the inequity that we have today. And the rage at that inequity has produced Donald Trump, has put him in office. That's why so many blue-collar people vote against their interests, because both parties for 40 or 50 years have basically abandoned them. So the karma of those 40 and 50 years may be a long period where things are going to be worse. And we have to be prepared for that. So I always think, start right where you are. Take care of your house, take care of your children, take care of the land where you live, take care of your neighbors. Václav Havel pointed out, there's no law that prevents you from sweeping the sidewalk in front of your store. There's no law that prevents you from greeting customers warmly and looking to take care of them. Those are activities within our control, and we shouldn't give them up to anxiety or worry or disparity. We should control what we can control. I continue to work politically, even though I know the system actually is rigged. Not like Donald Trump says, but rigged in favor of capital, rigged in favor of the wealthy. And I despair as I see so many people suffering. But if I shout, if I rant, if I misbehave in the streets, I'm forgetting that my actual audience of protests is not the police or not the legislators. It's the broad mass of American people who are watching and trying to decide, whose side are we on? Who are we with? So there may be a lot more demonstrations coming up in the future. And I'd like to share 5 quick ideas about how I think they'll be more effective and the way we should think about doing them. The first one is to know your audience, to know that to the degree that we're a democracy, you're addressing the broad mass of people between the Alleghenies and the Sierras. They may be more socially conservative than you are. They may be pro-life. They may be pro-choice. It doesn't matter. Those are individual decisions. Don't disrespect them, because democracy is a game of addition. We need 51%. So realizing that you're behaving for a broad mass of people, it's very important that we control the message of protest. And one way to do that is to appoint monitors for every protest, to give them easily identified yellow traffic vests or something and whistles. And all they do is they scan the crowd for violence, for provocateurs, for people who are misbehaving. Because what is a protest? A protest is an invitation to a better life. It's a ceremony. But very few people accept an invitation when they're being screamed at. So the monitors should blow the whistle at the first sign of violence, and all the protesters should sit down. And they sit down to discriminate themselves from troublemakers, from people who are not behaving ceremonially and with the best interests of all the people in mind. The second thing they should do, we should do, is dress like we're going to church. It's hard to sell men and women as terrorists when you're nicely dressed. If you look at the early civil rights marchers, they were in jackets and ties. The third thing we should consider is making the protests silent. Showing the discipline to be silent. Let your signs explain to the audience while you're there. But let your discipline show to the audience your self-control and your determination. And the fourth thing would be go home at dusk. In the darkness, you can't tell the cops from the killers. There's too much invitation for mischief. So go home. Come back the next day. So finally, I'd suggest that we start putting together a shopping list. What do we want? I mean, I have my own. But eventually, I think we may get to the place where people will be organizing a general strike. And what a general strike might look like is a big party where people decide to stop shopping. They buy a gallon of gasoline. They buy a quart of milk. They stop buying new clothes. They trade with their friends. It becomes hip to be wearing somebody else's clothes and keeping things and fixing things. Because if money is the organizing principle of this culture, then you have to attack the money. And my guess is that within a month, this will start to show up in the stock market. It will start to show up in the pockets of the people that are called the producers. It's not that it will be easy. We still have to pay rent. We still have to pay mortgages, unless the action were large enough that they couldn't evict everybody, that they couldn't put everybody in jail for non-payment. But in order for that to be successful, we'd have to have a shopping list. So I'm going to suggest a couple of things for people to think about. I'm not saying these are the best or the most, but these are the kind of things that seem to me core issues. We need full federal funding of elections, and we need a prohibition on all gifts and emoluments to legislators. If they need more money, we should pay them more, but then that should be it. Don't fall for the ruse of term limits. We have term limits. The term limit is called the vote. And that means you have to watch your legislators, you have to know how they vote, and you have to be knowledgeable so that you can pull them out of office. But when you set a standard, you lose also all the good people. You lose the institutional memory, and the advantage and the power goes to the staff. And then you have people coming in for shorter terms, and the tendency will be, oh, I've only got 8 years to be rich. I better do it right away. So full federal funding of elections is a big one. The ending of Citizens United, the ending of donations, anonymous donations from foreigners, from anyone. We don't want money controlling our system. The third would be ending personhood for corporations, so that corporations can't hide behind the Fifth Amendment and hide their records from criminal investigators. Fourth would be revising the tax structure to be equitable. When I was a kid, people who made over a certain amount of money paid 70 to 90% of their income, let's say over what would be $2 million today. They would pay 70 to 90%. And that's the money that built the America that we think of so fondly in the 40s and the 50s. That's the money that built computers, ports, highways, airports, subways, rapid transit, medical research. Those taxes are now somewhere in the high 20s for wealthy people. There's just not enough. Given what goes to the military, whose budget is the size of the top 20 largest military, they're not protecting us. They're protecting chess players from possibilities. We didn't have the money for rubber gloves and masks. We didn't have the money for rapid tests. So that you can go to Italy and you can get a COVID test in the airport and get on a COVID-free flight. You have to come 2 hours early. If we had rapid tests every day, we would know who we had to quarantine and who we didn't, and our businesses could be open. So our economy and our disheveling as a nation is largely related to the way we spend the money, as much as it is to lies and propaganda. So I'm going to stop there, but I'm going to encourage people to consider, what would your shopping list be? Might be equal pay for equal work. It might be that questions of pro-choice and right to life are individual decisions. They should not be the subject of law and government. But I would suggest people get them together, because there may be a time where these will be the subject of discussion. And knowing what we want is the precursor to getting it. Stay happy. Stay close to home. Protect yourself. Please be careful. And don't let them steal your state of mind. I'll see you next time. I'm going to do my little metta prayer. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. One last thing. It may feel odd for a Zen Buddhist priest to be talking this politically. But this is the world I live in. This is the world I counsel people in. And instead of talking about emptiness, very often I talk from emptiness and try to see things as clearly as I can. And so these conversations are part of enlightened discourse. Not that I'm the last word, but that the spirit in which I offer these ideas is one which invites response, does not offer them with undue passion and certainty, but as suggestions for public dialogue to raise the level of discourse in the future.